in my life, the most significant and amazing piece of science that's been done. And I'll tell you, to me, it's understanding DNA. It's not, the physics has been fantastic, but that was a real development that I would have not expected. And it is going to change things in radical ways, as you know. If I picked another thing, it's in my own field, which was dramatic, was finding that the universe was hot at one time and left a radiation that we can still measure now. And that, to me, that's sort of spectacular, that, you know, you can go and turn a radio on, and a little bit of a crackling in a radio is due to the initial explosion of the universe, which is sort of blows your mind. Yeah. I think, for example, our field, the one that we've just opened, the gravitational universe, the gravitational wave universe, would be very disappointing if it didn't give us something brand new that we haven't thought about. So I expect something very interesting to come out of that, primarily because it's looking at the universe in a completely different way. And I'm not trying to be, vain about it. It's just, when you think about it, that's a development which will, if it doesn't do it, it's in many ways it's a failure. I hope within the next 20, 30 years, there'll be a synthesis of two grand ideas, at least in physics. The idea of understanding the universe and its large scale, which is primarily a theory of gravity, and coupling that somehow to the theory of the very small, which is the theory of quantum theory and the theory of, atomic physics. And right now there's a real schism in there. We have not been able to make a quantum theory of gravity. And it's difficult, and I wish I understood better why it was so difficult. But it seems a lot of people are breaking their heads on trying to do that. And that would be a synthesis that would tell us a lot about both fields, by the way, if it ever gets done. I mean, we have a real challenge in the way the science is perceived by the society. I think, to me, that's probably something I never expected would happen. And that right now says that we have got to concentrate on a couple of things. One thing is that making it so that the science that we do is understandable by people who are not trained in the science. That's absolutely critical. Otherwise, they have absolutely no reason to believe in it. They have no reason to want to be interested in it. We've got to learn how to make people understand. And we also got to teach people how to deal with a world that isn't absolutely solidly secure in the sense that you know everything. In other words, when we don't teach probability theory in grade schools, we don't teach it in high schools even. And let people draw conclusions which are a little fuzzy. How do you draw a conclusion from a fuzzy thing? And that instead of just waiting for an expert to tell you, you want to have some sort of reasonable way of going at it yourself. And if we can't get people to think in such a way, we've failed, and we failed the society in the deepest sense. And that is something I would have not have said 5 years ago. Have you read the biography of Einstein by Walter Isaacson?
Yeah.
He did a wonderful thing when he wrote that book, because when his father sent him to the Anthroposophists school in Zurich, it was exactly that. It was his father saw something in young Einstein which was rebelling against the German school system. He describes it beautifully in the book, by the way, and this business of everything being learnt by rote. Mm-hmm. And what happens is he sent him to that school in Switzerland where it's the opposite. I mean, it's not all entirely practical, but you don't believe anything you haven't experienced directly. That was the opposite viewpoint. And the thing is that, so that you can't do. I mean, if you want to believe in nuclei and physics, you're not going to build yourself a gigantic particle accelerator. You have to believe something you read. But the things that you can do to make it, and so what Einstein did, and what came out of that for him, at least the way Isaacson describes it, is that he began to think of these thought experiments. That when you've got a new concept, you may not be able to execute the experiment, but think of the experiment in your head, how you might try to execute it. And that was a very profound way for him to think, by the way, because it led him to all these new ideas. So, see, he was not much of a mathematician. I mean, he was certainly far better than I am as a mathematician. But the point is that That's not his forte. His forte was his intuition and his way of visualizing. That's unbelievable when you read Einstein. So to me, that's Walter Isaacson did that better than Abraham Paez in his book called Subtle is the Lord, which is another very professional biography of Einstein, which is all about a scientific biography. But Walter understood this. You asked me, when did I begin to become a scientist? Well, it was very gradual. I mean, as a kid, for reasons I cannot explain to you, okay, I got very involved with gadgets and electronics. I started with enjoying playing with things, magnets. My father even introduced me to a magnet, which was sort of, in Prague when we were here. He moved a paper clip secretly behind a piece of paper, and he didn't tell me that. He didn't tell me that there was a magnet there. And I kept looking at it, I couldn't believe it, and he showed me what was going on. So, but then that sort of graduated, and by the time I had a remarkable thing happen to me, because I grew up in New York at the end of the war. We came to the country in 1939, but I was in high school when the war ended, and the city streets, there's a part of New York where a lot of the war surplus stuff got delivered. I mean, transformers, capacitors, vacuum tubes, pieces of electronics. You could buy for $1. You could buy a radar set. It was unbelievable what you could do. And so what I started building was all sorts of hi-fi equipment, which since I love music, that was the very first thing that attracted me. I could make amplifiers and FM sets, which were just coming in. I had a very lucky break that there was a theater in New York City, in Brooklyn, that had fire behind the screen. And this was, I remember, I must have been a sophomore in high school. And a friend of mine and I went down there. They were offering us the loudspeakers that had been burnt out. These big loudspeakers, 15-inch loudspeakers, all behind the screen. It looked a sea of loudspeakers. And so we got them down. We went on ladders, unscrewed them, took them home on the subway. I got about 6 or 7 of them. And then we figured out how to get cones for them from a company called Altek Lansing, which was the people who put voice into movies. And so what happened is in my room, I had a wonderful amplifier, a FM set that I made, these loudspeakers, 2 of them, and I was able to drive them, and we were able to listen to the New York Philharmonic, which was just at that time coming on the FM radio with full bandwidth and everything like that. And it was, my father, who was a doctor at the time, he was very mad at me for making it so loud. I mean, he had his patients in another part of our apartment, and it was too loud for him. So he would come in and complain, but he would listen. I could tell he would listen. And so he was very proud of what was going on there, I thought, because it sounded so good. So he invited friends of his, come and listen to the hi-fi stuff when the Philharmonic was on. And they all wanted one too. So little by little, I had to build, and they said, well, can you build me one also? And so I built a hi-fi thing using these speakers and all this stuff for several number of people. And after a while, I couldn't just keep up with people. They had friends who had friends, they had friends, and so forth. And this was before hi-fi became really something that was in the public mind. This was in the late 40s. So the problem I had was that phonograph records. That was the way you stored music. You had these big plates, and they were made out of shellac. Later on, they were made out of vinyl. But the way they were made out of shellac, and then when you put your needle in the record, it made a terrible hissing noise, like like that all the time. And it wouldn't bother you if the music was loud. Like, for example, the first movement of a Beethoven sonata was loud and fast. So the record scratch didn't bother you. But in the slow movement, that's all you heard. So I tried to invent a way of, and this is where not knowing really electronics, not knowing mathematics, not knowing enough really finally stopped the show. Because I tried to make filters that cut the high frequencies, but then when the music was loud, opened the bandwidth up again so you heard the full glory of the signal. And everything I made was worse than the record scratch. I mean, you hear, things like that, And so I had to go to school. And that's what made me decided that I should go to college. And so I got an MIT. Don't ask me how that happened, but okay. And I started as an electrical engineer for that reason. And that's when I got disappointed terribly that they wouldn't let me talk to the faculty or get to talk to somebody who knew enough about this. I had to learn all sorts of stuff first. And that's when I went into physics. And then I flunked out. That was another problem. No. I fell in love. And I don't know, how well do you know music? Do you know the Winterreise? The poems are crap as far as you know, but they tell a story of unrequited love, okay? And that's what happened to me. I mean, I felt this woman who was beyond anything I could imagine. I met, and she was a pianist, and oh my God, she knew everything, and she knew how to folk dance. Oh Lord, and I just went completely nutty. Okay, and so then she ditched me. Okay, because I mean, what the hell? I was a cipher. I mean, what did I know? Okay, and so what happened is what was described in the Winterreise. In other words, I would walk in the street and I'd see something shimmering over there, and oh my God, that reminded me of her. Or the sound of this particular waterfall in that park. Oh my God, that was her again. So, and each song in the Winterreise had another recollection of the time when he was still with this woman. And so that's sort of what it was like. And that's why I flunked out. Okay? It was just this overpowering thing. And so I got a job later on. I got a job in research labs at MIT. And that's what ultimately put me back together again. And I happened to be very lucky. I worked with a guy named Gerald Zacharias, who at the time was working on atomic clocks, and he was very interested in Einstein, and that sort of got me interested in gravity. And he eventually, through various techniques, managed to get me back into school and then into graduate school, and eventually was responsible for me becoming a faculty member there. I mean, in other words, this is, one mentor like that could make a hell of a difference to people. And he is the man but I wasn't at a low point. And then you asked where that happened, but it had nothing to do with the science. It had to do with, just being totally distraught by the fact that you were not worth a damn, Well, you're asking me what advice to give. I've given lately because I have now, I have this prize that was given to me, and among others, and that makes people think that I know more than I should, really, in the end. But I give advice freely now, which is probably a mistake, and people shouldn't listen to me. But typically, one thing I feel quite strongly about is that and that certainly was the case in my life, once everything straightened out, was that if it isn't fun, if it isn't a pleasure to work on what you're doing, forget it. That's not a profession you're going to be any good at, and you're not going to do anything important in it. If it's got to be something that you enjoy doing, and it has to be fun. I mean, really fun. It's the pleasure principle. And you take a look, and the other thing that's important, that's related to that, is I know fields are so competitive that people are all the time fighting with each other in a horrible way. And it turns out if your colleagues aren't convivial, maybe you don't want to be in that field either. I mean, you need two things. It has to be a pleasure, otherwise you won't work in it. And it has to be something you can share with people who enjoy you and you enjoy them in their accomplishments. And I've been very, very lucky that way. I mean, with my students, even some of I had some problems with one or two colleagues, but that wasn't, if that had been true of all of them, I would have been a mess. But that was only singularities. There were singularities. But then you say, okay, this is just not, you don't have to deal with that person, the hell with it. And so the advice I give is make sure that you go into something that you can really get a kick out of. And don't worry so much about the end point. I mean, a lot of people worry about how to strategize that they become famous and they do a great piece of work and they become God knows what. I know people do this, and I hate this when parents come with their kids and they're trying to figure out, how do I get my kid into this particular university and that working with that particular man? Don't strategize that way. Think of, how can I make that kid happy? Okay, what's the thing that will really make him smile about, or her smile about the thing is, and be a delightful person if they can. That's the most important part, and then they will do things. You watch. What you're asking me is if I have advice to give to people who can't communicate what they're doing to the average person well. And the only advice I can give is learn how to do it. I simply, because I'll tell you, you feel more and more guilty if you are working on, you're spending a lot of money, taxpayers' money, like we did, and you can't make it understandable for the people who paid for it. I think that's a bad business. I mean, I look, a lot of my colleagues are very haughty. They'll never, oh, I'm not going to try to explain this to people. It says, God damn it, try it. And you have to, suppose when you teach, what happens when you teach? And you want to get a graduate student working with you, you have damn well better explain the thing in such a way that you can excite that person into what you're doing. They seem to understand that, okay? But when it goes to trying to explain to a person who is not trained in science, they just rather not go to it. I'm not trying to blame people. I'm just saying you've got to learn how to do that. And I don't know where I learned what I did learn. I mean, I have taught an awful lot of freshmen in my life, okay? That's probably where I learned how to do this. Whatever I do know.